Good morning, afternoon, evening, actually, since there's so many people tuning from different time zones. Thank you so much for taking time off on your Saturday and maybe taking a break from obsessively watching the US vote count to join our session today, talking about tech ventures in the 2020s. My name is Dee. I'm a director for Young China Watchers based in London. And we thought it's particularly pertinent and timely to have this discussion today, given that Chinese tech firms have just seen such an unprecedented rise in the past decade, supported by a large domestic user base at first, and they've been expanding very rapidly abroad. If you look at the numbers, Chinese overseas tech investments jumped 100 times from around 200 million 10 years ago to 21 billion in 2019. And there's significant progress in R&D, especially in AI, IoT, 5G infrastructure, and life sciences. However, a lot of those optimism is somewhat dampened by challenges, either from geopolitics or from governance considerations. There is a series of app bans, as the previous panel mentioned, in India starting this year. In the US, the sale of TikTok is still an ongoing discussion with the potential ban of WeChat. Many countries have banned Huawei from their 5G networks, citing threats to national security. And just this week, On Group's much anticipated $37 billion IPO has been put on hold by regulators in China. So how does tech world look like going into the 2020s? What is China's role going to be in this new decade? So this is what we are going to discuss in our panel today. We'll touch upon the major trends that we've seen in the past decade, talk about US-China, of course, and also China's interaction with the other emerging market countries. So now let me introduce you to our esteemed panel. We're very honored to have Tom Tsao, co-founder of Gobi Partners, which is one of the first generation venture capital funds to be set up in China. Tom and his partners are the early investors behind some well-known tech startups in China. Tom also leads the team that manages Alibaba Hong Kong Entrepreneurs Fund and spearheaded Gobi's expansion to Southeast Asia and beyond. Tom is currently building Gobi's Taqwa Tech investment practice, which is focused on serving Muslim communities around the world. We also have Chris Schroeder joining us from DC. Chris is a global tech investor and entrepreneur. He has co-founded several tech media businesses and co-founded Next Billion Ventures that invests in early stage tech businesses across Asia, Latin America, and the Middle East. Next up, we have Bulelani Jili, who is a PhD student and researcher at Harvard University's African and African American Studies Department. His research interests include China-Africa relations, cybersecurity, ICT development, and internet policy. A warm welcome to all three panelists. I think for the benefit of our audience, maybe it'll be helpful for us to hear a little bit more from each of you in terms of your background, the seat you're in, the angle you've been observing tech in China, and the most significant trend you've seen with Chinese tech over the past decade. So maybe we can start with you, Tom.
Sure, Dee, thank you so much, and I'm delighted to be here. That was an amazing panel prior to ours. I hope we can hit the same bar. My name is Tom Tsao. I'm calling in from Kuala Lumpur. And as Dee was saying, I'm a venture capitalist. I've been doing this now for more than 2 decades. My vantage point is Gobi, we were investing in China when China was still considered an emerging market. And this was in the early 2000s. I think for me, the key change that we've seen over the last 20 years is when we first started investing into Chinese entrepreneurs, the mindset was very different. People were just happy if they could become, a clone of a US company. And in fact, we even had a name for that. We called it C2C, which was copy to China. We'd go to Silicon Valley back in the old days, spend a couple of months, couple of weeks, and then we'd go back to China. And it was like we were from the future, because what was going on in Silicon Valley was just eye-opening. And when you went back to China, you felt like you knew more than everybody else. And the model back then was, you saw what was working in Silicon Valley, kind of copy that, bring it back to China. Of course, you'd localize it and you tried to do something similar. The biggest change now in the year 2020 is the confidence of Chinese entrepreneurs. they're no longer just thinking, I'm happy being the biggest one, in Shanghai or Beijing. You could see the evolution. They wanted to be the biggest one in China. And then they realized that I could be the biggest one in Asia. And I can go head to head against the biggest international players. And that's why you've seen the rise now of companies like Alibaba, Tencent, Baidu, ByteDance. It's the increase, I think, in confidence. And Chinese entrepreneurs over the last 20 years feel like they can take on the best companies in the world and they can win. So that's one of the key differences that I've seen over the last 20 years.
That is very interesting. Chris, would you say that you are seeing the same level of confidence growing also among Chinese entrepreneurs you have been kind of working with and dealing with?
Oh, I think absolutely. And again, let me add also, I'm thrilled to be back with Young China Watchers DE, so thank you. And to be with my friend Tom and the brilliant Bulelani, so it's awesome. My lens, of course, is not just in China, but really the rest of the world in America, thinking about China overall. And when I think about the trends, we could all have a great conversation on AI, machine learning, robotics, and tech. But for me, the great trend, which is little understood in the US, is not the tech itself, but the access to it. So it's now a cliche to say 60, 70, 80% of humanity has a supercomputer in their pocket. And that, of course, has meant unprecedented connection and collaboration and empowerment and the ability to reach customers with unprecedented affordability. But what we're really doing is we're unleashing effectively billions of customers, not even including China, and that scaled enterprises, as Tom is alluding to, are coming from China, but everywhere in the world on their terms. So China obviously is exhibit A of all this, but now there are mini Chinas from Jakarta to Cairo to Nairobi to Warsaw to Sao Paulo, in all sorts of parts of the United States. I think it requires a new engagement that we Americans are having a hard time processing, right? The old playbook with all this connectivity is that we Americans just show up, the WhatsApp of anywhere, the Instagram of whatever, anywhere was that. But now, to Tom's point, large enterprises are meeting unique local regional needs. They no longer want one-stop shop US products alone. And the thing that is so amazing is there's no legacy in these markets, right? I mean, these are people who have not been banked before, have had mobile mining before, haven't really bought online before. So the new products are being created are not encumbered by the past, but they're looking at things for the future. And what is also cool is that everyone around the world are building these astounding, unique data sets, locally and regionally, which are unique, which are hard to replicate. AI tools are everywhere. So that is incredibly important. So as Tom was alluding, we got to get over the idea of Western copycats, because everyone's going to be copying everyone. I mean, I have no doubt that Facebook is thinking about TikTok, not just as a juggernaut, but for its product innovation and capability. So for me, the new playbook is really about co-authorship. From a governance perspective, there's a lot of sleepwalking going on right now. And I think there's a real scenario of a balkanization or divide of technology. The US government tends to look at technology from a risk abatement perspective, like national security, that kind of thing. And this has been compounded, I think, with these shifts I'm describing, which are concerning for them. But most startup world is bottom-up phenomenon, but the top-down will matter. So right now, small countries like Estonia, Singapore, Dubai, arguably China at scale, their governments are looking proactively how to rethink regulation environments, not to fit legacy rules of the past, but on the terms of new realities. And it surprises a lot of people, and Tom can talk about this also, that places like Brazil and Indonesia are very proactive in their governments to meet with entrepreneurs, to meet, for example, should be, not what banking regulation was. So we have to stop sleepwalking and think about this more strategically.
That's very interesting, the point you touch upon in terms of governance and how the government is thinking more proactively actually around that aspect. So I'm keen to hear from your side, Bulelani, given that your research touches quite a lot on global internet governance and regulations. What have been the major trends that you're observing actually in the past decade related to Chinese tech?
Yeah, sure. Firstly, thank you for your time and consideration. And I'm also very happy to be sharing the stage with Christopher and Thomas. As it relates to your question, I'll try and tackle it in two parts. The first one will attempt to speak to trends, and then I'll somewhat underscore some of the governance concerns. The general trend that we've seen from Africa-China relations is that it's a continuation of the historical precedent that was set in the post-colonial era, which is that the Chinese invest in developmental projects across the continent. And what we're seeing now is a more sophisticated version of that, where numerous diplomatic instruments are being used in order to meet the challenges of investment aid and infrastructure building. And the Digital Silk Road in particular is touching across the continent and meeting demands and wants of ICT infrastructure on the east coast of Africa, but also all the way down to South Africa. And so, for instance, about 70% of the African continent's ICT infrastructure is just built by Huawei and ZTE alone. This means that these are paramount players in determining the general infrastructure landscape of the continent, but more than anything, it means that they're creating entrepreneurial environments for the continent that many young entrepreneurs are in fact leveraging. And there are in fact a number of promising startups across the country, across the continent, in South Africa, but also Nigeria. As it relates to the question of governance, and this is, a core part of my own personal formative research, where we kind of look at how does Chinese infrastructural projects further escalate trepidations about security concerns. And what we've seen, particularly in the cases of Ethiopia, Uganda, and Zimbabwe, is that in fact, Chinese infrastructural investments in ICT without checks and balances has rendered citizens more vulnerable. And so as it's had positive consequences in terms of creating entrepreneurial environments for young Africans to leverage development prospects, we also see the fact that governments like Uganda have been using ICT infrastructural projects backed by the Chinese in order to spy on political opponents and then undermining democratic expectations and prospects on the continent. And so from that standpoint, it then demands of us to think more innovatively in terms of our regulatory approach, in terms of meeting this technical inflection point.
Thank you very much. That's a great intro to our panel discussion. I think some of those topics will come back throughout the panel, but before we dig deeper into kind of governance and regulations, I think it will be quite interesting to talk about US, China altogether. It's almost like you cannot talk about China independently without even mentioning US in the same sentence now. Are we seeing a tech Cold War with what's going on right now this year? I think, Chris, you said very well in terms of technology now being a zero-sum game, but is in any way politics forcing technology to become a zero-sum game in our current environment? I'm keen to hear your thoughts from the panel.
So I do not believe tech needs to be a zero-sum game, but obviously it certainly can become, and some juggernauts take over within countries, let alone globally. But I think a takeaway is that whatever the election results are, is that the concerns and the debate and discussion about China is very much a bipartisan issue. In fact, in the last 4 years, it's probably been the single most, and maybe only really bipartisan issue overall. I suspect the patina of Biden administration will be a more kind of engaging one with the world writ large. But the political reality is that there's going to be, I think, a lot of sort of pushing back. So the question to me is, what are there opportunities for shared interests, right? And in the tech world, you look at things like disease detection and global environmental issues, water and energy, and for goodness sake, these are enormous issues that are only better if we figure out ways to work together overall. By the way, I talked before about a few billion new people coming online. The fact is 2 billion or more have no access at all. We're effectively saying, go out and compete in the world, but you're not allowed to get on the road. That seems to me a hugely shared interest overall. And so the reality is China is only going to continue on this extraordinary path. And we can sleepwalk to this Cold War analogy that people, my age and older like to use all the time. Or we can ask ourselves strategically, what do we think this world should look like politically, technologically, business, and ask ourselves, okay, there are places we disagree and we're going to disagree, but there are also places of incredible opportunity to co-author. And it's time for some creativity so that we don't, again, sleepwalk to an outcome that in my view is in no way inevitable, but it will take both sides to make a determination it's in their interest to do that.
Very interesting. But what can promote that kind of collaboration? And in your opinion, what is really kind of stopping us from collaborating better, given so many topics are indeed global?
Well, first of all, I think that often in the American press in particular, I can't speak for over there, tends to be a tremendous amount of focus on all the conflict, where in point of fact, there actually have been a lot of engagements that have been going on that have been constructive even over the last 4 years. And these are things that can be built on I think, in terms of like trade disputes. Actually, a lot of them have been very resolved in good faith. And that there's been a lot of actually interesting sharing at the science level, particularly around COVID. And so there are things to work with. But I think you got to know where you want to go. You have to have a strategic sense of what are those shared interests. And a lot of it is going to be in trust building exercises. And I think that there are opportunities. Space would be another one. I think that there are opportunities where there can be trust building in this dynamic. I have no doubt that a new administration will look to do much more with allies around the region. That can be viewed as either threatening or can be viewed as an opportunity to do something more holistic together. It will not be easy, Dee, by any stretch of the imagination. But again, I'll just emphasize, either we take those steps and see where they come, or we are on an inevitable path for which the end results 3, 5, 10 years from now, I think all of us have to scratch our heads and say, is that what we're hoping will happen?
Yeah. And what about you, Tom, from your perspective? Do you see this trust building exercise, being something that could happen perhaps in the near term?
Yeah, I think a lot of it really depends on the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think, the analogy I have is the U.S. just needs to start competing, right? At least from my vantage point in Asia. People, the world looked at the United States with admiration. But over the last couple of years, it's just, you look at what's going on with the pandemic, the lack of, bringing the pandemic under control, the lack of testing. I mean, these are things when, back to my point about confidence, when people around the world are seeing the U.S. response and how they're handling things, it affects the mindset. And so I think the view from around the world right now is the U.S. is making a lot of excuses, right? And it's almost like the U.S. can't compete anymore. So they're coming up with all these excuses. Oh, Huawei, it's a national security concern. Really? Maybe. But the fact of the matter is, as Bulelani was saying, was, the world wants connectivity. Offer a solution. So if the U.S. government is saying Huawei is no good, well, go to a country and say, don't buy Huawei, buy, I don't know, a U.S. manufacturer and offer, low-cost financing so the country can install it. I think the rest of the world is starting to see through that, which is, national security. Is it really a national security issue? I mean, Prime Minister Tun Mahathir in Malaysia, he was saying, we care about the connectivity. We have nothing to hide. So who cares if people are spying on us? My point here is the U.S. is still using a lot of this Cold War language to try to kind of contain China, and in many different ways. I'll give you some more examples of the hypocrisy. Is one, okay, Hong Kong, really bad, right? China suppressing the protesters because, they are freedom protesters, right? But when those same types of protests are happening in the U.S., you have a president saying they're rioters. So again, it's confusing for the rest of the world. Where is the consistency? So the message has to be, look, if you want to take these measures, right? In some ways, the U.S. is becoming more like China, right? China kept out Google. The U.S. is now thinking of banning WeChat. To me, what it looks like is the U.S. has to compete, right? Instead of talking, it's like, hey, let's back it up. I'll give you an example. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, right, wanted to say, hey, he was telling countries not to take money from Belt and Road, right? It's a debt trap. But you know what? Developing countries, they were willing to consider that. And then they were waiting for the U.S. to offer an alternative. And so when Secretary Pompeo announced, he said, okay, we're going to have a program to counter Belt and Road. We're going to commit $3, and everybody was waiting. Is it going to be 3 trillion, 3 billion? It was $300 million to Southeast Asia. So it's really hard for people to say, you've got China willing to step in. You can question all the motives you want, but countries need infrastructure. The US, Europe, all these countries had opportunities to fund infrastructure. And I'm going to ask Bulelani that, right? Nothing happened. All of a sudden now China wants to come in and it's debt trap, lack of governance. I don't know. It's confusing. And I think the US needs to compete more. It can be a race to the top, right? Competition is not a bad thing between China and the US. Don't make it a race to the bottom and try to demonize each other. I think that's the key point here.
Could I have just a quick response to that, very, very briefly, because I want to hear Bulelani. Yeah, just quickly. I mean, three things. I mean, first and foremost, there's not an American I know in government or in Silicon Valley, or whatever, who should not listen to what Tom just said and play it back 2 or 3 times. Because there's some things on the margins that I might not necessarily agree with, but I think the substantive point that he makes is a very, very important one to consider. At least it should be part of the debate. Secondly, I mean, in fairness, the fact of the matter is it's all good to say, well, America should compete. Well, you know, China's made it very difficult for American tech companies to compete in a market of 1 billion people. And so that's why there has to be a co-authorship to this and a reciprocity where we don't get hung up on who's done what to whom alone. There'll be some of that. There has to be some of it. But what are the areas of shared interest overall? And then thirdly, I think it's about to be a new day. And so I think we have to be careful about painting a straight line through the data point alone of the last 4 years. I do believe that psychologically and structurally, we are viewed quite differently in the world today, with substance as well as style. But let's see what is about to happen and where it can open up. Because look, I wouldn't argue with much of what he said about COVID treatment, but I will tell you something else. What's happening in biotech in America right now in the last 6 months is a total revolution. We have stood up without precedence 150 different vaccines. You talk to any scientist in America and they're living in the golden age of science today. We're going to see things happening in cancer treatment and whatever because of our response to COVID, which will also be part of the equation. So I think we all have to just breathe and try not to make this about who did what to whom alone. That's a dynamic, but to ask ourselves what new kinds of conversations that we can have.
Yeah, very interesting. And Bulelani, turning back to you, on Tom's point about, prioritizing having infrastructure rather than going into this rabbit hole of, governance debate, would you agree from kind of your research and also the perspective on the ground, is that really a priority of just, having access first, despite, potentially surveillance concerns or anything like that?
Yeah, without a doubt, a lot of the major discourses surrounding Africa, China have to relate with some of these kind of spillover discourses about, the historical precedents that Europe set with the African continent and how China is possibly, a new colonial power. And every single time this narrative picks up traction in the West, on the Africa side, most people are kind of just like, are the Chinese bringing in money? Are the Chinese bringing in infrastructure? That's what we're concerned about. And so on the ground, very much similar to Tom's point, is that most people are definitely looking for connectivity. On the policymaker side, that's where you kind of get the discourses about national security and so forth. And I do think that, Tom is absolutely right in terms of illustrating and speaking to competition as relates to, China and the US. And particularly China, obviously making it a quite difficult environment for them to compete domestically, but internationally, it seems to me open and fair game. The United States, particularly as relates to the African continent, has really, not competed much. It's in fact, the United States has lost interest in the region and has articulated almost a degree of apathy towards it. And that now they're acting surprised that about 70% of, Africa's ICT infrastructure is built by the Chinese shouldn't be, alarming to them. And as it also relates to some of the, permeating discourses, particularly as it relates to debt traps, thus far the research has shown that we don't really have any conclusive evidence to illustrate that, in fact, Africans are being ensnared in debt traps. In fact, a lot of the time, these things are resolved at a bilateral level between the Chinese and the respective African countries. And I would also agree with some of the remarks made about Cold War framing, which is not only disabling discourse, but it's also calcifying both aisles. But as it relates to, national security concerns, I think the real, but it's more so about how do we, have regulatory approaches that meet our day. Thus far, a lot of the framing of national security is there to disable innovation and is to disable entrepreneurship. But if you take the privileging of, of regulation as relates to meeting people's security concerns, then that's when I think it matters. And so, for instance, on the African continent, the African Union has already put together a cybersecurity policy framework, but only about 5 African countries have ratified it thus far, which obviously then empowers Chinese corporations to determine how people will be engaging with these technologies. And so to me, what is quite of importance is really about putting together a regulatory approach that all parties can agree upon in order to meet the challenges of the 21st century, particularly as it relates to the question of privacy.
Hey, Bulelani, quick question, if I could. From your research and what you're seeing in Africa, is BRI without concern? Are there any concerns that in your research you see that people have, or do they believe this is smooth sailing and just a net positive?
Yeah, I'd say that most people see it relatively as a net positive. One of the major forms of trepidations that African interlocutors have with the Chinese is the fact that they just really want to see technology spillover effects. The historical consequences of the African continent, particularly as it relates to the question of development, has always been about the fact that African entrepreneurs, African businesses, and African thought leaders have not really had access to technology. And so they want access to patents. They want innovation centers that will produce products that are locally informed, but will also have spillover consequences for the economies. And so on the point of technology, when they're speaking to the Chinese interlocutors, the question is how long are you going to be here, and whether or not are we going to own this technology? And also, how are you going to ensure that you're going to be partners with us for a long duration of time in order to ensure the kind of positive outcomes that we're looking for. And so the trepidations, particularly on the entrepreneurial level, is never really about national security. That's for the policy wonks. The local concerns of everyday people has always been about making sure that these technologies meet domestic needs and wants, but also meet development, which requires access to technologies.
Fascinating.
Very interesting. I do want to touch upon the competitiveness point that Tom, you mentioned. I do think from our perspectives, you see, significantly more investment coming from China into global emerging market countries. But I do want to ask a question about talent, actually. China has a vast population, a vast talent pool, and that's been really kind of driving some of the innovation and progress. But one challenge I think one would say is, does the Chinese political system actually appeal to global talent? Because, on the back of the US growth in technology, it's the congregation of talent from all over the world, right? But there are not as many people, looking or hoping to migrate to China the same way as they hope to migrate to the US. Do you see that could potentially become a bottleneck?
Yeah, well, I think, again, the old joke was, who did China want to win the presidential election, right? Actually, if you were to ask the Chinese government, although they'll never admit it, they wanted President Trump to win again, because President Trump has done more to accelerate talent going to China than anything China could have done, right? The US is built off of immigrants, right? I mean, the anomaly right now is that Silicon Valley has had like this monopoly on innovation for the last 40 years. The anomaly is not, all these innovation centers now spreading out across the world, right? And so I think, our hostility to immigration has only driven so many aspiring entrepreneurs who were committed to creating ventures in the US. And now they're rethinking, right, the cost benefit. If I'm not wanted or welcomed in a country where I wanted to contribute my talents, maybe I'm going to take it and come back. We saw it happen, right? The sea turtles in China, the sea turtles in Southeast Asia, Wapistanis, right, in Pakistan. You're seeing all these people who are now getting educated in the West and realizing that, I can take my talents and I'm going to set up ventures to solve problems back home. And again, one of the key trends we've seen, remember I said C2C, which was copy to China 20 years ago, copying from Silicon Valley. Now, China's flipped it on its head. There's a new term, it's called CFC, copy from China, right? The same pilgrimage we used to make to Silicon Valley. Emerging markets entrepreneurs are now going to China, right? They're doing that week-long tour pre-COVID, Shenzhen, Shanghai, Beijing. They want to know what the future is now. They go to China. They want to see what's going on and they want to bring it back to their countries. So yes, and again, Dee, I take that point. But again, I think, again, that's one of the US strengths. And I hope under this administration, again, we open it up, right? The US was built off of, immigrants. And again, China is starting to open up as well, right? There are policies in the next 5-year plan, which is Shanghai, the Greater Bay Area. It's all about attracting talent. But you have to remember, China was a very poor country just 20 years ago. They lifted 800 million people out of poverty. I mean, that's a real accomplishment that never gets really talked about in the West, right? So again, the narrative in the West is that, oh, people are really unhappy, they're oppressed, they can't, they don't have human rights. Yeah, I talk to my friends in China, my colleagues. People are very happy right now, right? They look at the world, they look at the pandemic, they look at how China dealt with that. They are leaving the US, coming back to China because they feel safer. And when they look at the rise in income levels, people are fairly happy. So I think that narrative that, the communists, again, commie, that term itself is a loaded term. And Chris is laughing, right? It's like you can no longer have a conversation because the easiest way to put down someone is you're a communist, you're a socialist. All of a sudden the conversation stops. You cannot have a real conversation. Let's get past those labels. We have to give credit where credit is due. I think, again, I hope we talk about this later, is there's a lot that China can still learn from the US. And you know what? There's some things now that the US can learn from China.
I mean, I'm laughing a little bit in part because Tom and I share a friend who's a very well-known figure in investment in the government of Singapore, who said to me about a year ago, he said, Chris, what do you think is the most important thing that's happened to the Chinese AI industry and research and companies? And I knew he was asking something. I didn't know what the answer was. And he looked at me and smiled and he said, your immigration policy. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. I think a lot of people have wanted to go home anyway. If you can go home and you can succeed at home and you can make impact at home, I think that movement has been a phenomenon that's happening anyway. But there's no question that our immigration policy and a lot of our outlook right now has compounded that in a way that I think is not only not constructive from a global perspective, but amazingly unproductive for us. But at the same time, I think it's worth also noting that a lot of the people that Tom and I know quite well in Southeast Asia also will ask me quite regularly, where are you guys? And so there's not like they want to be partners just with one place. There's a reason why TPP passed even without us, right? I mean, the folks are also wary of a big juggernaut rising anywhere. And there's an opportunity to engage in the greatest strengths that we have, to have a counterbalance among different operations as people are building together themselves. And Tom's last point is sort of my beginning and my last point, which is we need to have conversations, which is going to be very hard in the American political environment, no matter who wins, about co-authorship, to have the strategic sense that there are things we all bring to the table and the ways that we could build success collectively in those areas is a very difficult conversation, sadly, to have right now. And so let's see what happens.
Great. I do want to touch upon the point that Tommy mentioned about U.S. learning from China and China learning from the U.S. Assuming we're in a friendly environment where people want to learn from each other, what would you say are the key things that each side can actually share with the other?
Well, I think again, another loaded term is democracy versus a communist party, bureaucratic system. So again, those are loaded terms. What I would say, so let's take out those value judgments. I think China benefits from long-term planning, right? They don't have this short-term election cycle. Like if you're a U.S. congressperson in the U.S., you're elected for a 2-year term. By the time you get elected, you're already planning for your re-election, right? You look at the presidential term here, it's 4 years. I mean, in my mind, maybe, again, just to toss it out there, should that be a 5-year term? I don't know. What I've noticed from China is that they can just take a longer term view. And again, when you're really trying to make these longer term investments, right, into industrial policy, which for some reason is anathema to the US, right? It's like government and business can't work together, right? And again, those are things where, China, they take the government, they take industry, they work together with the community, and they push certain sectors that they want to get into. You look at China's adoption of clean tech. I mean, I remember 5-6 years ago, the air in Beijing was unbreathable. They really took drastic measures to increase the air quality. That takes real leadership in an entire community. My concern is that, again, in the US, the short-term political cycle is really driving this polarization. It's hard to see how these big strategic decisions can be made. And maybe that's something the US can learn. Now, what can China learn from the US? I agree with a lot of the panelists from the former panel. What Bulelani was saying is China has to have a better PR strategy. My God, the communication from China is so bad. They got to figure out how to engage with the entire world. And again, part of that I think is a language issue. A lot of Chinese people, they're more shy speaking in English. But again, I think the way China communicates with the world is higher degrees of transparency. And again, the language. When you read a Chinese text, the official spokesperson talking, it's always in this very kind of official, rigid text. There's no, references to pop culture so that the average person in the US or in the West or Europe can relate to it. I think maybe what I'm trying to say is China, for example, Belt and Road, the benefits of Belt and Road. How do you communicate that so that the average person can relate and go, oh, it's not a nefarious scheme? How do you communicate it so that, Huawei's 5G isn't spreading COVID-19? Right. I think China's communication strategy needs to be a lot better.
That's very interesting. To be fair, there was a rap song created for Belt and Road Initiative. They just never. So definitely some work to do on the PR side. Bulelani, would you say that's one major thing that China can learn from the US? Is there anything else you think China could learn from the US, and then also vice versa?
Well, I do think this point of communication is quite salient. Primarily, as relates to the fact that the Chinese, when they do communicate, they say very little, which then leaves a lot of African audiences second guessing as to exactly what they want. And particularly, the US honestly has said really nothing to Africa in the last at least 4 years. And what they have communicated is, a want in order to build, stronger US-Africa relations. However, those relations have been encumbered by the fact that they are currently on let's say, trade war with China. That trade war obviously has had massive, spillover effects primarily on African markets. And what we kind of see is that, it's effectively reduced commodity prices, and it's overall really undercuts the China, at least the US's want to be more competitive on the continent, and has also given the Chinese now a speaking point to say that, the Americans really are not interested in partnering with Africa. And so from that point, the Chinese have said very little, but, the US has almost said nothing. And what they've communicated in terms of their action has also created, more speaking points on an anti-American note.
Super interesting. And Chris, from your perspective, would you tend to agree on that point?
Yeah, I think absolutely. I mean, I think having a very detailed conversation on all forms of this are important, because to me, the communications element is not inconsequential, but it's only a small piece of this. And in fact, if I could give my time back to Bulelani and to Tom, one of the big questions that I'm trying to get my mind around, and I think thoughtful people in America are trying to get their mind around, is what is it that China wants? I mean, there's a lot of discussion about what America's done over the last 4 years and these things that we tripped up or not tripped up over. But you need to have two partners. You can't dance alone. And if you guys would give me just kind of a sense of, 2 things, 3 things just off the top of your head that you think China wants out of this relationship and is willing to do it in a co-authored way, I think that's something people would want to hear.
Maybe I'll start first. I think, I mean, if you, I recently read a book called Prisoners of Geography by Tim Marshall. Fascinating.
Tim Marshall. Yeah,
I think if you go back to that book, I think China wants a couple of things. If my guess is that one is from a geopolitical standpoint, the Taiwan issue is something from a geopolitical standpoint that's important to China, because it would be the same as, think about how the U.S. reacted when the Soviet Union tried to put missiles in Cuba. Right? It's just Taiwan is so close to China. It's a very important issue. I think people in the West just don't get that. And I think at some point, if I were to guess, there has to be a solution to that, because that's from a geopolitical standpoint, the geographical position of Taiwan is too important to China. Right. So I think that's one. And if you were to see what's going on in India, this Himalaya border standoff, again, it's completely explainable from a geographical standpoint. Both countries want to get access to the origin of all the water that comes from the Himalayas. Right. Again, I'm not spouting any new points. It's basically what Tim Marshall's saying. So I think from China's standpoint, it's like, listen, China does not have any intention of trying to be the policeman to the world. Right. They're willing to let the U.S. take the lead on that. I think what China's saying is that, look, we can share some of that burden. The U.S. doesn't have to do everything. I mean, this freedom of seas thing, I mean, why is the U.S. assumption that China's trying to do it? They're trying to monitor as well. It's not necessarily just for China's benefit. Now, again, I'm throwing out something that's very controversial, right? To change the mindset. Right? There's a way where China can shoulder more of the responsibility, so the U.S. potentially could spend less on defense and invest more in America's infrastructure. Right? People have always said, oh, China can't afford Belt and Road. Let me just give you a statistic. The Iraq and Afghanistan war cost about $1 trillion. Belt and Road costs about $1 trillion. So what's probably more productive? An investment into the Belt and Road countries or fighting a war, right? So these are things that I think, we should think about. I think China just wants to continue developing. I think they're starting to open up. They don't want US-style democracy in China tomorrow. It's just not going to happen. And I think, as we've seen with this last election, what's going on, the democratic model, I think from a VC standpoint, probably also needs to be, there could be some innovations. It's been a hundreds of year old model that probably could use some refreshing. I mean, for the life of me, I can't understand why we don't have mobile voting apps. We can transfer billions of dollars online. We can't make sure people vote securely. I mean, there's got to be some blockchain mobile app. If somebody has that idea, please find me. I mean, just the very process of using paper ballots. I was watching that thing on CNN. I mean, that mind blowing. So again, these assumptions, sometimes when we talk, the East-West conversation is like, democracy is almost like a religion and becomes dogma. You almost can't have a conversation because all of a sudden we say, oh, China, you're communist. That can't be good. Right? If you're communist, you don't care about personal rights. I already saw some of the questions in the text box. I'm just saying, rethink those assumptions. I saw some of the questions. So what is China doing on the technology that's so bad? I'm going to ask some of the questioners, because I saw some, I forget the exact question. But again, those are assumptions of the media narrative. Right? I'd love to hear Bulelani. Can I say one thing? Bulelani, when you said there were concerns about putting in the 5G and then the governments were using that, again, I think it's my point, which is the technology is neither good or bad. It's how people use it. And so if you're not buying it from Huawei, you're buying it from Ericsson, governments can still spy on people. You see what I'm saying? Whoever's supplying the technology, it really doesn't make a difference. And again, the last point I want to say, Snowden. I mean, the assumption is that the Chinese government's spying on everybody. The Snowden big reveal was that the US government was doing it already. The assumption that everybody in the West enjoys this like sacred privacy, I think that's I'm not quite sure that assumption's true. My assumption is I'm being spied on by everybody. I invest in a lot of tech companies. Everybody's taking your data. If you think you have any privacy if you're online, you are really kidding yourself. Okay.
I think this is definitely a very interesting and also potentially controversial topic, actually, for us, all of us, actually. I mean, what would be interesting is actually, let's move away from kind of the heat of like US, China, especially tying politics into technology, but talk more about maybe China's interaction with the other emerging market countries. And I think, you know, Tom, you did mention China having an advantage compared to Silicon Valley for understanding other EM countries better. I mean, Chris, you're investing really across the world. Are you seeing that dynamic as well panning out in Latin America, other parts of Asia and Africa? And then I think what could be quite interesting is also, you know, leading to our poll question, which region, in your opinion, might benefit the most from Chinese tech's growing presence and investment going forward?
Which dynamic precisely?
In terms of, you know, China having a better understanding of emerging market countries compared to Silicon Valley.
I had this amazing experience, which I've had repeated, and it's actually part of the thesis of Next Billion Ventures, which is that there's amazing shared things among rising markets that Silicon Valley and New York and so on just don't understand. And a year ago, almost to the date, I was actually in Hangzhou with about 17 startups from Latin America and Africa and Southeast Asia in fintech, scale of companies, not little companies. And we were meeting with a lot of the juggernauts in China. And it became clear to me just watching the engagement that 70% of the conversation were issues about last mile logistics, navigating regulations, educating people who had never had a bank account before. I mean, all these things shared among these markets that China was completely fluent on because they, as Tom had pointed out and Bulelani has said, were a rising market, very short order before. It was complete understanding of the language and the engagement. And it was a very powerful thing. And I think a lot of us underestimate that power and that kind of an understanding, which I think is appreciated in the markets. One entrepreneur from Latin America turned to me at dinner that night and said, you know, these guys understand us much better than you do. And this, by the way, you know, is a guy who had, you know, gone to Stanford and like had been very engaged in America. And I think we need to take that very seriously because this new dynamic that I opened with is one that is very real and that I think that we can participate in if we're willing to listen and co-author. But there's no question it is something that the Chinese experience is much more relevant to a lot of the places. I'm sure Bulelani's seen some similar things in Africa.
Yeah, sure. As it relates to African countries, they definitely do consider, you know, China as at least a brethren in the global South. And China in itself consistently communicates, particularly as it relates to communication with Africa as a country that is seeking development. And so that's why you consistently see China's no strings attached approach with African countries, specifically as it relates to aid and investment, which is almost antithetical to the Western model in terms of providing aid and development, which consistently comes with strings to it, which of course generally come with some democratic normative expectations in terms of how those resources will be used. And so that sparked a lot of conversation, particularly as it relates to aid, about how it should come about. Obviously, you know, you want a degree of flexibility that will be able to meet local market needs. And so a lot of, you know, young folk in particular enjoy the really the opportunity to have a no strings attached approach with a lot of the investments in aid, while simultaneously there's also been, and you can imagine, concern as in terms of whether or not this leads to other questions around, you know, things like debt traps and so forth. And so there's a lot of positive, you know, engagement with China, particularly as it takes on a global South identity, while simultaneously that narrative also erases some of the local nuances. It's true that they're a developing country, but, you know, developing countries are at different stages. And so it's also quite important to also exercise and think more critically about, well, what are the nuances as a global South country with different histories and different kind of cultures. Yeah.
Super interesting. So maybe let's move to some of the questions that have been popping up on the chat. There are quite a lot. And actually, I think one question is quite interesting on, you know, large Chinese tech firms like Alibaba and Tencent having a lot of control and influence. I would say you can say probably the same about Google, Facebook, etc. Right? So how do you see that having any kind of societal, economic, cultural, and political influence, given that big tech is really concentrating a lot of the power and yeah.
Tom, you want to start? I have a thought, but I'd love to hear you.
Yeah, no, I think the concentration of power is not just a Chinese issue. It's an issue that's a global issue. I do think what's going to be interesting for the Chinese companies is as they get bigger and they have global aspirations, how do they embrace diversity? I think that's a very interesting question that the Chinese companies, they all have aspirations to be global. And I think there again is where the Western companies have done a better job, right? Where they've embraced these ideas of diversity, multicultures. And when you look at the top management teams of Chinese companies, and particularly the Chinese tech companies, if they really want to become global, how are they embracing people from around the world? I've always said that if you want to be considered a truly multinational global company, for example, if one of your employees say, like for a Chinese company, if you have a colleague in South America, does that person really believe that they can become the CEO of a Chinese company? And if that person feels like they could, then you are truly a global company. And I don't think many Chinese companies meet that bar yet. And so I think that's going to be a challenge, not only for the Chinese tech companies, but for the big Chinese companies in general, as they become bigger and have a global footprint. How do they engage and how do they, add diversity to their senior most management ranks is something that's, I think, is going to be very interesting to see how that develops.
Just 3 quick add-ons to that, because I think it's right. I spent a day with Didi when I was in China a year ago, and they, of course, did a major acquisition in Latin America, and were completely candid with me of the complexity and difficulties they had in being local, while at the same time having Chinese not only culture, but technology and other platforms. And I think everyone can have that wrestle. If you don't understand local, you'll be toast. So this will be an interesting patina. Second is, it is awesome to meet with Alibaba and Ant and Tencent and all. I mean, the capital data customer advantage, low CAC, UCAC, you can literally, launch any product essentially for free and reach 700-800 million people is a staggering thing. And so I asked some fintech entrepreneurs, is this game over? I mean, how does a fintech company compete against this with those kinds of advantages? And some young entrepreneurs said, I wouldn't touch this space right now. That new things will come, 5G will come, but right now it is very, very hard to have innovation in the space with that kind of size and juggernauts. In fact, I asked the venture capitalist, "Is this true?" He said, "That's ridiculous. Entrepreneurs always have competitive advantage." And I said, "Okay, name one. What area of fintech is open right now in light of the juggernauts?" And he paused for a very long minute and said to me, well, there's no lending for gamblers. I'm like, okay, well, if that's the best solution you're coming up with, you may be making my point. And the last thing turns back to America, because it is true. We're really wrestling this question right now. And I think that there are lots of things that have been protected innovation. But the fact is we're making this an antitrust issue. And historically, antitrust was, do the customers get screwed in pricing? Like, does someone get so big that they can hurt you and make you pay what you want to pay? But of course, most of the juggernauts are effectively free, right? There is no pricing issue with that. So the big question does become, what is a disadvantage? We're paying in data. Is that a disadvantage? We're paying in other things as well. And I want to make sure here anyway, and speaking only for America, we don't throw the baby out of the bathwater, because the fact of the matter, there is astounding innovation and some amazing things coming out of the juggernauts as well, both here at home and globally. I mean, the services are loved in many respects, even if people like to beat up on Facebook because of algorithms and all. So I think we need to be ginger about it, but you're going to see a lot more of it because people are wrestling. What does this size really mean to us as businesses, but more importantly, as society?
Any thoughts from you, Bulelani?
Yeah, sure. What I was going to say is that it's quite important, particularly at least as it relates to the Africa side, to try and create the regulatory frameworks and environments that will invite the kind of innovation and engagement that we see across Asia. But also more than anything, it's also somewhat important for the Chinese to be more clear as to exactly what do they necessarily want from Africans, but also more than anything, what can also Africans provide to China? I think the previous set of questions in particular try to speak to some of the historical trends of China's relationships, and it's quite obvious in terms of access to natural resources, access to populations. But also what is quite important is also then from the inverse in terms of, I think it's quite obvious why China's engaging with Africa. It's also important then to figure out, well, what can Africans get out of this relationship? And a lot of the time it's always been contingent on getting access to aid and investments. But it's also more than important than anything is also to kind of have sustained investment and interest on the continent. Unfortunately, when people generally engage with Africa, it's always in these small pockets of windows that have not really enabled accelerated growth. And I think by creating the kind of political frameworks from the domestic level is important, but also then from a foreign policy perspective is also maintaining those developmental goals and aspirations with partners that are actually willing to work in more risk environments.
Very interesting. Yeah. I think some of the audience questions also touch upon surveillance tech, and I mean, it will be quite interesting to hear from you. I think a lot of the maybe challenges or questions around kind of Chinese political system is not necessarily around communism per se, which is the economic side, but rather, the state control, and then maybe there's limited separation between private sector and the public sector, shared more with government. And Tom, you already mentioned some of that. Maybe we are, to a certain degree, overestimating the separation actually in other countries that are democratic too. But surveillance tech is quite prominent in China, and then I'm keen to hear everyone's thought on that.
Sure. Can I take this one first? Because I think it's quite important to somewhat elucidate the current stakes that are available in terms of surveillance technologies. What is quite clear, for instance, is that in terms of AI surveillance technologies, on the Africa side, about 13 countries have purchased these kinds of technologies from Chinese counterparts. Now, whether or not they're being used for legitimate or illegitimate purposes is really country specific. But the idea that China is attempting to promulgate these technologies in order to spread authoritarianism is a problematic framework that is not illustrated by any particular data point. But what is clear is that when these technologies arrive without any checks and balances, it then further amplifies the possibilities of domestically led surveillance and suppressive practices. And so my particular point, at least as I raised in terms of the 3 cases that were made available earlier, was to illustrate that in fact, a lot of the suppressive movements with these technologies have been contingent on domestic forces and not anything that's particularly outside of those countries. And so when we are being critical and we're asking for regulatory approaches, a lot of the time it's about meeting regulatory approaches at the domestic level, while simultaneously also attempting to engage China to think more critically about who are they choosing to partner up with. When you're choosing to partner up with Zimbabwe, it should be also clear that they have a track record of human rights violations. Of course, it's obvious that you're looking for a partner in business, but also you also should be more aware of that person's background and so forth.
Yep, great. I think maybe now is a good time for us to take a pause and then throw the poll back to the audience and see if there's any kind of opinion change throughout the course of this debate. So now on your screen, you should have poll 6, which is the same 3 questions that we asked at the beginning of this panel. It would be great to just get everyone's vote now, and then maybe Michael, you can follow up with how this poll results have changed throughout the session.
Very happy to, Dee.
Yeah, we still have around 30 seconds for people to vote. But super interesting. I mean, there's just so many topics for us to discuss on Chinese tech, and I'm sure we'll have more and more of those discussions, going forward. I think what could be interesting is also like while we're waiting for the poll results to come in, hearing quickly from each of the panelists, what do you think are the advantages for China to lead in global technology in a new decade? And what could be the obstacles to that position? Anyone wants to be the first to tackle this?
Well, I'll just give a quick jump in on it. I don't love the question of who leads and the zero sum implication in it. I think that there's going to be a lot of leadership coming from a lot of different areas. I think we're going to see incredible leadership from Jakarta. We're going to see amazing leadership from Sao Paulo. We already are in certain areas. Now, obviously, China is a juggernaut. America is a juggernaut. London is a juggernaut. You know, there are lots of folks that will, by the weight of size, be important. But I think the question is not to think about this. In fact, it almost makes it into a Cold War question. The question shouldn't be who's winning. The question could be what can be unleashed to have the greater global impact where people can learn from each other and take the best of technology and innovation, frankly, to make the place safer and better in the environment and things like that. So I think the more open we are, the more engaged people are, the greater ease of movement of people and ideas, and open rule of law is the path that is still, it could be a powerful one. And right now, it's unclear that will happen.
Yeah, maybe again, I'd throw in an analogy here is I think, you know, the last 4 years is really, we've lost a lot of time. It's almost been like Game of Thrones. And I'd argue that in certain regards, the former or current administration has been acting like Cersei Lannister, right? I mean, the real threat, the White Walkers represent global pandemic, climate change, right? Pollution, deteriorating oceans. That's the real enemy, right? It's not necessarily US versus China, right? On an entrepreneurial level, entrepreneurs get along with each other. They want to solve these problems, right? If governments are making people choose sides when we've got really large global problems, I think that's not a good use of everybody's time, right? I think, again, the pandemic has shown if anybody's suffering anywhere around the world, we all suffer, right? So it's not a zero-sum game. And if I could end this on an optimistic note, I'm hoping is that everybody takes a step back and realizes, you know, who the true enemy is. You know, who are the real White Walkers here? It's not China versus the US. You know, when COVID's over, you know, knock on wood, that's going to happen. You know, we're still dealing with climate change. We're still dealing with pollution. We're still dealing with deteriorating oceans. That's why I think, you know, ESG, impact investing, we're at an inflection point. That's definitely going to turn up. And I think that's a good thing. And I hope that cuts across geographies.
Great. Bulelani?
Yeah, sure. And I think on a very positive and similar note, I think what this moment with COVID has illustrated to us is that, in fact, that, you know, challenges can be met if they're met with prudence and with rigor. I'm obviously here speaking from, you know, the South Africa and Africa side, where relatively what I think our governments have shown with very little is that they actually can get things done. And so as we're kind of looking towards the future, our future definitely will at least have two, I think, distinct marks. I think it's going to be, you know, further integrated and more dependent on digital infrastructure. And so we then need to shore up these infrastructures in order to create environments for entrepreneurs, you know, to do what they do best, which is to innovate. But also, more than anything, it's important then to also be keenly aware of whether or not these new changes are going to, you know, have spillover effects that do lift the very bottom. Because I do think that the most pressing issues, particularly relates to the United States, is just kind of this rabid and calcifying inequality that we also then need to somewhat underscore and deal with before it becomes, you know, the linchpin that ends all democratical enterprises.
Yeah, very interesting. I think our hope is all for, you know, more global collaboration and really kind of, you know, collaborative problem solving if possible. I think going back to Michael, do you want to maybe talk about the poll results and how that has changed perhaps throughout the...
Yeah, I do. Very happy to. I'll focus on just the one question in which we've seen a bit of a shift, which is question 1 in relation to views on whether or not we think Chinese technology governance will converge or diverge with Western norms. I think off the back of our the chat that you've curated and sculpted with Chris, Tom, and Bulelani, we're seeing an increase in people expecting a divergence. It appears as though, despite the optimistic note that Tom tried to land on, we certainly uncovered a vast array of problems and challenges that need address and attention. But handing it back over to you now, Dee.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Great. I think, you know, there must be so many more conversations for us to follow up on this. I don't know if any of the panelists would like to share maybe their Twitter handle or anything else with the rest of the chat for people to kind of reach out to you and then have a more specific discussion. I think that would be really helpful. But to conclude, you know, I just really want to appreciate our panelists' time to spend either early morning in the US or late evening in Malaysia. I think this has been a very fruitful and thought-provoking conversation. It's always useful to see from different angles. And I think, you know, part of YCW's aim is actually to have this kind of discussion and really challenge some of the status quo thinking that people might have related to China and other parts of the world as well. So really appreciate everyone taking the time, and thanks for the audience for amazing list of questions that, you know, we only got to address part of them, but still, you know, your participation has been great, has been just very fantastic.